quite nice not to have to wear a mask, isn't it? Took me quite a bit of time to find my mask this morning. I was down at church and I made a few drinks and I was looking for my mask and I was sure I'd taken it out of the car. And so I had a look in the car again, at the back of the car in case I dropped it. And then eventually I found it around my neck. So that was quite smart, really, isn't it? They remind me a little bit when you wear them around your neck. I didn't have much to do with horses when I was farming, but sometimes people with horses would put a feed bag over the horse's nose and horses quite enjoy that. That's what the mask sort of remind me of a little bit. Anyway, we've got a little story. The crowds were thickening as the time for the Passover drew near. The roads were full of pilgrims as they made their journey up to Jerusalem for the festival. Family groups, wives, husbands, and children, many with lambs in tow, ready for the sacrifice. Others depended on the markets in Jerusalem to supply their offering. All headed to Jerusalem to remember God's saving work of old, delivery from slavery, from foreign rule. It must have been so exciting to have lived in those times of God's breaking in on Israel's behalf. I'm mused. Not like the time we experience now, the might of Rome all around us. I smiled at the irony of it. God's promised land might be our home, but the harsh glare of Roman rule was our lot, and I was knee-deep in it. Sometimes I wonder about joining the pilgrims. I'm Jewish, just like them. But perhaps that's where my closeness with my fellow people stopped and started. I was too well known to hide in the crowd. And in the fever of the Passover, a collaborator with Rome, like me, would be easy picking for some zealot keen to put their knife to work. Even with all the extra guards who were sent to Jerusalem at the time of the Jewish festivals to make sure no one started an uprising, there'd be no safe place for me in the city, and especially if I wanted to go to the temple. I did find myself longing for something different for my lot. I chose it long ago, and for many years I had no problem. There was no doubt I was good at what I did. There was no mean feat to hold the post of chief tax collector in a busy place like Jericho for as long as I had. Herod the Great was the one who really put this place on the map when he negotiated it from Caesar Augustus. Herod spared nothing in the scope of his building projects. He really wanted people to see him, to show off to Caesar and to gain more political might. His palace was amazing. Befitting a king, massive and beautiful, with these huge ornate pools and the aqueducts that service the city with water. Perhaps the might of Herod's rule was seen in the hippodrome, built in the ancient part of the city, the extravagance of it all for rich people to play games. No one wanted to get on the wrong side of Herod, ruthless as he was, but he certainly knew how to get things done, making sure people like me extracted every denarius of tax due. So his many lavish building projects throughout the land, not just here in Jericho, could tell the story of his might as king. It was a strange system where he was allowed to call himself king, but he was very much under Roman rule, just like the rest of us, and he was required to extract a massive tax from the people back to Rome. Yet he still managed with a bit of cunning to name things after various Roman gods and Caesars, so he could carry out his expensive building projects and so make his name great too. Sometimes I used to ponder the injustice of it all. I lived as one of the fat cats at the top of the tree, yet the vast majority of ordinary people did all the work, the manual hard work of farming and fishing and trading and running stands in the market, importing products and then selling them off to the minority of people like me, I guess, who had the money to buy them. We had a huge number of slaves at our beck and call, ready to do whatever we commanded them, and no choice or freedom would ever be theirs. The ordinary people didn't get to He built it on the backs of people like me and them, I guess. I ran the system that funded the Roman rule and allowed rulers like Herod and his offspring to succeed. I tended the tax amount I would take from the citizens of Jericho and its surround. From the traders who came through, I ran the team of tax pickers. They all answered to me. I had to pinch myself to believe it sometimes. I was just a short little guy, nothing to look at. But I made the most of my opportunity and had really risen above my status in life. I was one of the elite, or the rich ones in Jericho. Not that I came from a family with any name or money, or even that I gained real honour for my role as chief tax collector, but I had the voice of the important people. I knew from years of service who was growing and selling what, and the elite tolerated me. They needed to, or the might of the Roman system would come swinging, and we all understood that. My gang of tax and toll collectors did the hard graft, and I got the reward for their work. No one wanted to pay tax, but it didn't take that much to make sure I got my share. No one could stand against the might of the Roman rule. The peace of Rome, they called it. A very polite way of saying the emperor gets his tax to fund the expansion of his empire and his lavish living for him and his mates. The ordinary people paid a collection of their crops as tax or money if they were traders or workers. Rome always made sure everyone knew who was boss. The ordinary people living hand to mouth, only just enough to survive, always having to graft out their living. Still, I couldn't complain. I may not truly fit anywhere, hated by the Jewish people I truly belong to, since I aligned myself with Rome and extracted such a harsh level of tax that it required to keep the empire running. Tolerated by the Greek and the Roman elite, obviously not one of them, but living among the wealthy elite of the city, with all the luxury a man could ask for or more. I'd made plenty over the years. Jericho was a wealthy place, a nice place to live, I thought, with its tropical climate. I overheard the murmuring of the slaves as they stood off to the side. I liked to keep an ear out for what was happening in their world. They had many connections among the slaves of other elite families, and it was always helpful in my line of work to hear who was and wasn't doing well, and why this might be. Information and knowledge was key in a role like mine. I couldn't afford any affront to Rome. I was intrigued if I overheard them speak of a rabbi known as Jesus from the province of Galilee. I'd heard rumours of him for a few years now. The Jewish rulers in Jerusalem were up in arms over him. They even sent out parties of officials out from Jerusalem to visit him in the rural areas. I wasn't sure what all the fuss was, but if the flesh cats in the temple were heading down to see him, then it must have been some fuss that he'd been making. They didn't like to put themselves out from the pretty tidy life they'd created for themselves in Jerusalem. They made it very clear I had no place in God's kingdom, as one who supported Rome and enforced payment of taxes. But I didn't see how they were much better. They too lived as elite people, a ruling class, at the top of the tree, so to speak. And from what I heard, they were often in collaboration with the Herodian officials and Pilate to make sure that they had their place in the sun. The servants were quite earnest in their discussion. They knew not to draw attention to themselves lest they get told off by the senior housekeeping servant. Yet despite some strong shushing, I found it easy to cast an ear to their conversation. I didn't hear all the conversation, and nor did I want to call the servant out and officially ask for a full account, lest I draw unwanted attention to myself. But it did sound like this Jesus had healed a blind man begging on the roadside outside of town. Caused quite an uproar by the sounds of it. I can imagine the merchants cursing. It was hard enough to move goods as it was at this time of the year, with the crowds heading for Jerusalem and Passover. If this Jesus was healing people, then the road would be impassable. The throng of people who gathered would be impossible to ship. Still, I suppose with more people to sell That's more goods to sell to, more tax for my men to collect. Maybe I should think about putting a few more on that road. I could easily miss out on some revenue. It was a nice evening to pass the time with a good wine and the sun slowly setting. It was a truly beautiful picture. I found, though, my mind kept getting distracted from the beauty of my section and the setting of the sun to the servants' discussion. Still, I didn't imagine it would bother me for much longer. Jesus' time would be short-lived if he continued on towards Jerusalem at Passover time. Even with the crowd between Herod, Pilate, and the Jewish leaders, they kept a strict rule on things. Any teacher who incited the people against Rome would end up toast. It was a fine balancing act on all sides. The Romans allowing what they saw as our strange temple system, and the hordes of pilgrims travelling the country at the time of the festivals to Jerusalem to celebrate and give their offering. If they didn't allow it, then experience told them that people would come anyway. And when you did allow it, if an individual or group's voice became too strong and incited the people to uprise, it was quite a difficult thing to put down. But at least I guess you had a better idea where the threat was and a sizable garrison to quickly put them to the sword. I wondered if the peasant teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, knew he'd made such a fuss among the Jewish rulers. If he wasn't careful, they'd pick him off before the Passover, lest he tried to build any opposition that would embarrass the local leaders and cause a response from Rome. Healing the beggar wouldn't allow any privacy. The crowd would continue to point him out and bring the sick before him from all around. As I took my morning stroll through the streets, I could see the crowd was heavier than normal. I had my servant push on ahead to find out what was happening. Intriguing, I thought, as he reported back to me. All these people at this time of the morning, all to see the Rabbi Jesus. I wondered what he looked like. Did one who could heal the blind look different from the rest of us? The crowd were very vocal, talking and pestering one another about his healing of the blind man. I found myself wanting to see what he looked like, and then a plan began to form. I had no chance, being the little shorty I was, to see over the crowd, so I would run on ahead. It had been years since I'd run anywhere. Anyway, well, it's not proper for a man like me to run, not with my status, but I did want to see this Jesus. I needed to get ahead of the crowd, blocking my opportunity. My heart was thumping in my chest like crazy, and even in the cool of the morning, the sweat quickly formed. My servant's wide-eyed look reminded me that what I was doing was not what was expected of me. He was forced to run along with me, but he was obviously much more attuned to such activity than I was. Soon I was out in front of the crowd, and then I saw the gnarled sycamore fig tree, a bit short and squat like me. It had been years since I climbed a tree, but its big branch reached out over the part of the road, and it would be a perfect vantage point for me to see what was so special about this Rabbi Jesus, and maybe even some cover from the heat. My servant tried to stop me, but I brushed him aside, and he had good sense just to wait at the base of the tree. It was a welcome relief to pause in the branches of the tree. Slowly I could see Jesus and his followers walking up the road, the crowd continuing to press closely on all sides. Imagine my surprise when he got below my vantage point and called me by name out of the tree, inviting himself for the night to my place. I found myself coming out of the tree with much more poise than I thought possible, and soon I was standing there in front of him. Everybody knew that I was a tax collector, and he, Jesus, a rabbi. The mutterings of the crowd were inescapable, building in pitch. How did we smile at the outrage of it all? I hardly expect Jesus to realise his error and withdraw his request, but he remained steadfast, and soon, along with his followers, we were on our way to my place. I enjoyed the conversation as I walked along together with him and his followers. I and the others understood the scandal of Jesus' invitation to come under my roof and to enjoy my hospitality. was to welcome and accept me. It was most unusual for a rabbi, concerned with ceremonial cleanliness like they usually are, to even have time of day for me, a tax collector, a collaborator with Rome. But this didn't bother Jesus. It was like we'd known one another for a long time. Soon came to understand more of who he was and welcomed his invitation to follow him. Imagine me, a tax collector, hosting the long-awaited Messiah, the Son of David, King of Israel, in my place. It felt so good to be in the middle of God's redemption. I felt so liberated by his acceptance, his welcome into the family of God. The reciprocity of grace was soon at play, and I gladly declared to Jesus that I'd give half my fortune to the poor, and if I'd wronged any, then I'd pay back 4 times the amount. Some might see me as trying to bribe my way into the kingdom in God's favour, but Jesus knew it was out of thankfulness for the salvation he had already declared mine. His words startled me, and not just me, I suspect, as he declared me, a true son of Abraham, and that salvation had come to my house. I smiled through the noise as I could overhear the wonder in my servant's voice. Never had we hosted such a party as this. Sam, do you want to bring that? If you've been around church for a little while, you might recognise the story. It's sort of loosely taken from this passage. So Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now, I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." Amen. Any thoughts or questions? I realise I'm not too used to doing this, but sometimes at the end of my messages I like to just invite a response. You might have some insights or thoughts, or God may have spoken to you as we've read and gone over the passage together. Anyone got anything that they want to raise or think it's important for us to know from this passage? Nothing. That's all right. Yep.
One thing that gets me is the mass of their master.
Yep.
Because as a chief tax collector, is there a perception that he's cheated lots of people? And so if he's going to pay the back 4 times, and he's already given away half the way parts, this whole thing is sort of like this whole thing of he's over-committing to something quite incredible as his reaction to Jesus.
Yeah.
And then how does he wake up next morning and think how he's going to do it with the line of people outside hearing that story? Just how he feels that that's his response to the grace is so much that it's beyond our normal understanding of what I would do.
Yeah.
The maths doesn't work.
Yeah. So you can tell Jason's profession as an accountant, and sort of the numbers, but yeah. And I guess among commentators for a long period of time, some people have wrestled with that at times, and commentators would differ about it. Some of them would argue from a viewpoint that would see what Jason said, that as a chief tax collector, it was common and well known in Rome, I think, that tax collectors they would tender them out. That's what they would have to supply, and anything they got over that was theirs to keep. And generally it was thought they were good at making sure there was plenty that was theirs to keep. And Zacchaeus is a chief tax collector. I think that's the only time in the ancient world that they're aware of that term is expressed. Generally it was just tax collectors, but he's sort of like that, big cheese tax collector. So you would assume that if all the other little tax collectors are making lots of coin out of it, then he's really making lots of coin out of it. And most people think he lived as an elite person. But some think that perhaps he was different than some tax collectors, or the popular picture, and that perhaps he was able to do it in a way that was legal, but wasn't actually sort of cheating people, so that he wasn't wronging people. Other people would argue that he was a typical tax collector person, but perhaps the maths just doesn't work, and that's part of the God's maths at play, I guess, where we come to God with God gives us, if you like, a generous offer of eternal life and salvation, and that's part of the picture of response. That's a heartfelt response to knowing our lives are saved and in God's care. Thank you, Jason. Anyone else, any thoughts? Or there's lots of really common themes in Luke's Gospel here. You've got someone on the outside or the margin coming into God's family, and throughout Luke that happens for lots of different people, and it's sort of, people would say it's really significant too. It's probably one of the final stories before Jesus is entering Jerusalem. You got a little play with the story before with the blind man, couldn't see, then could see, and Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus. So there's lots that they sort of